If you think about government responses, the government responses have been limited pretty well everywhere. And actually there's a very good reason for that, which is that if you think about the way a democracy works, you have to have a strong and independent press which is capable of holding power to account. You have to have journalists in every country who can say, actually, Minister, what you're saying is not true. And if you think about that in the context of fake news, the wrong response would be to say, right, we will give the government lots of power to control the news. Because somebody somewhere is going to say, oh, I've got the power to control the news now. Well, I didn't like that headline about me the other day. So there has to be a limitation on what governments and lawmakers and international organizations do about the news, because we need the news to be free. We need the news to be independent, and that means independent of political control. What you have seen, and what's most promising, is that the media themselves have woken up to this. They've woken up both to the fact that it's a problem and to the fact that they are being targeted, and that at various times various different media have broadcast stuff which turned out to be fake news. Now, for a real journalist and a real news organization, that is a damage to their reputation, to be found that you have not done your job properly and you've broadcast fake news. And there is a lot more writing in the media, in the real media, the mainstream media nowadays, about fake news, disinformation, propaganda, how it works and how it fits together. And that is therefore spreading the understanding and spreading the concept of what the problem is.
And what is the role of these big media data companies like Facebook and Google and the others in that game? Because they are, in some of them, they are more powerful than some of the governments.
They are, but again, it's you need to ask the question: is it Twitter which is more powerful, or is it a person who has 100,000 followers on Twitter who is more powerful? Is it the user, or is it the platform? The main way in which platforms like Twitter and Facebook get abused is that people create networks of fake accounts. For example, I recently discovered a network of fake accounts on Twitter, which had at least 9,500 accounts all running the same thing. So that's one person who can run 9,000 different accounts. Anything they tweet can get amplified 9,500 times, just like that. That's incredibly dangerous, and that is the sort of system which platforms like Facebook and Twitter absolutely need to crack down on.
So, as somebody who really research, what do you give, because there is a general idea, there are fake news, there are bots, there are all kind of, there is cyber warfare, but what's really happening? What are today the most popular, unconventional ways of using the information? Besides, we can speak a lot about Russia today, but in particular, what are those tools, if we go in details, that you found?
There's one technique which you see time and again. I think of it as vilify and amplify. So let's say that you're a foreign government, you control everything from the foreign ministry to the broadcasters to internet trolls to internet bots. You find one person who says the thing that you like, and then you get all the different parts of your machine to amplify that message. And you point to it and say, look, it's not us saying it, all we're doing is reporting it. But the effect is to take one person's voice and to amplify it 100,000 times. And by doing that, A, you're encouraging other people who believe the same thing to speak louder, and B, you are making that person artificially loud.
Are we specifically speaking now, for instance, Russia is often mentioned, but is they are doing something unique? Or some kind of the practices, we follow the US elections, but in generally today, can we already speak about some particular, groups of people in the geographic areas which we can identify using the practices you describe?
Something we've seen a lot is groups from the political extremes will effectively work together with Russia to promote a particular story, to tell a particular story. And normally that will be all about attacking somebody from the political center. And you can't say who started this. For example, in France, for decades there has been a very strong nationalist far-right party, the National Front. It's always been there. In Russia, for decades, there has always been a state propaganda system what we've seen in the last few years is that Russian state propaganda has been supporting the far right in France, and the far right in France has been supporting Russian state propaganda. And if you ask yourself, well, where did it start? You're kind of missing the point. What's important is that you have this devil's alliance between the Kremlin propaganda machine and the far right in France, both of whom have the same goal, which is to make the political centre in France weak and to make strongly pro-European sentiment in France weaker.
And we ask, what in the end is really the evidence that Russia is that strong in cyber warfare?
One of the problems we're seeing now is a lot of people aren't being very subtle in their analysis. And it's at the stage where anytime anybody, for example, sees the operation of a botnet on Twitter, some journalist will phone me and say, was it a Russian one? It's like, well, it might have been. It might equally have been a French one or an American one or a Canadian one. And so there is... You always need to be very precise in your definitions. What we do know about the Russian operation is that a number of credible expert groups in the cyber industry have said independently that individual hacks have been traced back to Russian hackers. And in fact, the other day we had President Putin saying, well, maybe it was patriotic hackers, in the same way that a couple of years back President Putin said, well, maybe the Russian soldiers in Ukraine are just patriots who are there on holiday.
But really, if you speak about the organization like NATO, like EU, who are on it, really, do we have the funds allocated to the cyber defense? And if that, what that? Training the professionals, buying equipment?
In terms of the official responses, for example, NATO has a cyber defense division which makes sure that NATO's own systems are secure. That's its job. There's also a cooperative cyber defense center in Tallinn where various different countries come together and basically test each other's cyber defenses, and they run joint exercises and they try and make sure that they've all got cyber defenses in place. So there's cooperation going on. But again, it wouldn't be NATO's job to run the cyber defenses of a NATO member state. That's the job of the member state. In the same way, it's not the EU's job to run the defences of the member state. It's the job of the member states. And within the member states, it's not the government's job to police my email account. That's my job. And so the problem with cyberspace above all is that cyberspace is everybody who has an internet connection. And ultimately, you don't want somebody else reading your emails. And therefore, you need to be careful about how do you protect your own. So it really starts with the basic user. It starts from your own keyboard at home.